Everyone in this town says I look like a dead girl. I moved to Millbrook to start over. It was one of those tiny towns with 2 stoplights. The landlord stared at me when I picked up my keys. You look really familiar. Have we met before? I told him I'd never been to Millbrook in my life, and he nodded slowly, but kept glancing at me sideways while I signed the lease. At the grocery store, the cashier did a double take and said, "Oh, you're back." And when I said this was my first time there, she got confused and mumbled that I looked like someone but couldn't quite place it. By the end of my first week, I'd had the same interaction with at least 15 people. But what bothered me wasn't the recognition. It was the fear. The coffee shop owner's hand shook when she gave me change. A group of teenagers crossed the street to avoid me. I finally cornered the hardware store owner, an old man named Carl who seemed more curious than afraid. "Everyone in this town thinks they know me," I said. "Who do I look like?" He studied my face for a long time, then said, "You really don't know?" When I said no, he shook his head and said, "If you don't know, it's not my place to tell you," and disappeared into the back room. That night, I couldn't sleep thinking about those words. I started going through old photo albums looking for any evidence I'd been here as a kid, but there was nothing. I called my mom asking if we'd ever visited Millbrook, and she'd never heard of it. But when I mentioned the town to my aunt, she got quiet and said, "Why are you asking about Millbrook?" When I told her I'd moved there, she hung up on me. I tried calling back, but she wouldn't answer. Finally, she texted, "Get out of that town." The next day at the bank, the teller went white when she saw me and brought back the manager, who looked between me and something behind the counter before asking for 2 forms of ID. While I was pulling out my license, I saw what she was looking at, a photograph taped to the wall. It was grainy and distant, but it looked like me. "What is that?" I asked. She quickly covered it with a paper. "Security protocol," she said, but her hands were trembling. I went to the library to look through old newspapers, but the librarian said their archives were unavailable. When I pressed her, she leaned in and whispered, "February 2019, then walked away. I searched online for Millbrook February 2019, but found nothing. Every link was dead. Every news article removed. Something had been scrubbed from the internet. A week later, I was walking home when I noticed my apartment door was slightly open. Nothing was missing, but things had been moved. My photo albums were on different shelves. My laptop had been opened. Someone was trying to figure out who I really was, just like I was. That night, I heard voices outside my window. When I looked through the blinds, I saw 5 people standing across the street in the dark, just staring up at my window. I recognized the bank manager and the librarian among them. When I opened my door to confront them, they were gone. The next morning, there was a note under my door. "Stop pretending you don't remember." I called my aunt again, and this time she answered. "You need to leave," she said. "Today." "What happened in February 2019? I asked. "How do you know about that?" "Someone told me to look it up, but I can't find anything." She was quiet for a long time. "There was an incident. A woman. She looked exactly like you." "What kind of incident?" "I can't tell you that," she said. "But she's gone now. And you need to leave before—" The line went dead. When I tried calling back, the number was disconnected. I packed my things, but when I went to my car, all 4 tires had been slashed. The bus station was closed for maintenance. The taxi company said they didn't service Millbrook anymore. I was trapped. I was walking past the cemetery when I saw fresh flowers on a grave. The headstone had been recently cleaned, but the name had been scratched off, deliberately destroyed. Only the death date was visible, February 15th, 2019. Behind the stone was a small memorial photo in a weatherproof frame. I picked it up and my blood went cold. It was me. Exactly me. Same face, same eyes, even the same small scar above my left eyebrow from when I fell as a kid. But I'd never taken this photo. I was wearing clothes I didn't own, standing in front of a house I'd never seen. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see half the town standing at the cemetery entrance, just watching me. Carl stepped forward. "We always knew you'd come back," he said. "That's not me," I insisted, holding up the photo. But I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure of anything. Carl smiled, but his eyes were cold. "It's time for you to admit what you did to this town. It's time for you to pay." "Carl." I backed away from Carl and the crowd, my legs shaking so bad I almost tripped over a grave marker. The memorial photo was still in my hand, and I shoved it in my jacket pocket as I moved toward the cemetery's side gate. Nobody tried to stop me, but I could feel all their eyes following me as I walked faster and faster until I was running down the street back to my apartment. I locked every lock on my door and pushed my couch against it for good measure, then sat on the floor with my back to the wall trying to catch my breath. My phone buzzed with a response from Kareem Richards, the civil rights lawyer I'd contacted earlier, asking if I could talk right now. I called him immediately and my voice came out shaky as I explained what just happened at the cemetery. He listened without interrupting, and then started giving me specific instructions in a calm voice that made me feel like maybe I wasn't completely losing my mind. He told me to download a body camera app on my phone right now and turn it on anytime I left my apartment. He walked me through creating a detailed log with dates, times, and descriptions of every incident since I arrived in Millbrook. He said I needed to get a small security camera for my apartment door as soon as possible, and explained how to file for a protective order if the harassment continued. The way he talked about it made it feel like a real legal problem with actual solutions, instead of just me being paranoid or crazy. After we hung up, I spent 2 hours typing up everything that had happened, organizing it by date with all the photos I'd taken attached. I found a cheap security camera online that could ship overnight and ordered it, then printed out a notice that said my apartment entrance was under video surveillance as of today's date. I taped the notice to my door even though the camera hadn't arrived yet, hoping it might make someone think twice about trying to get in again. That night, I actually slept a little better knowing I had a plan, and someone on my side who understood what was happening. The next morning, a box arrived with the security camera inside, and I spent over an hour reading the instructions and setting it up. I had to download an app and connect it to my Wi-Fi, then adjust the angle until it captured a clear view of anyone who walked up to my door. I tested the motion detection by walking back and forth in front of it, and watching the recordings on my phone to make sure everything worked right. Once I was satisfied it was set up properly, I felt a small bit of control return for the first time since I'd moved to this town. I decided to try a different way of finding information, and drove to the county clerk's office in the next town over, figuring they might have records that Millbrook couldn't hide or delete. A woman named Isabel Peterson was working at the records desk, and she looked up when I approached. I asked about any public records related to incidents in Millbrook during February 2019, and she turned to her computer with a puzzled look on her face. She typed and clicked for several minutes while I waited, and then she frowned at the screen. She told me that records for that time period were sealed by court order, which meant I'd need a judge's permission to access them. She said this was really unusual for routine public records, and that she'd never seen something like this for a small-town incident. I could tell she was curious about why I was asking, so I briefly explained that everyone in Millbrook thought they knew me, and I was trying to understand why. Isabel leaned forward and lowered her voice, saying that if I was looking for information about a specific incident, I might have better luck searching birth and death records instead of police or court files. The way she said it felt deliberate, like she was trying to help me without breaking any rules about what she could officially tell me. I thanked her and left feeling like I'd made progress even though I hadn't gotten the actual records I wanted. That afternoon, while I was sitting in my apartment, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message had just 2 words: Ask Crowley. I stared at it trying to figure out who sent it and what it meant, and my first thought was to take a screenshot and save it to my evidence folder. I showed the text to Elena later when she came to check on me, and she thought for a minute before saying she remembered hearing about someone named Crowley, who used to be a police officer but left town suddenly a few years back. I asked if she knew how to contact this person, and she said she'd ask around carefully without making it obvious why I wanted to know. The next day, I found a note slipped under my door with a phone number written on it, and the words, "Former officer, resigned 2019, lives 2 towns north." My heart started racing because I realized this person might have actually been there when whatever happened in 2019 went down. I spent the rest of the day trying to decide if calling this number was smart or if it would just make things worse. Meanwhile, Kareem called me to work on drafting a detailed harassment log using all the incidents I'd documented. He organized everything by date with descriptions and attached all my photo evidence. He explained that he was starting to prepare paperwork for a protective order application, and that we needed to show a clear pattern of behavior that made me fear for my safety. Going through everything and putting it into legal document format made the whole situation feel more real and more serious than when it was just happening to me day by day. I realized how much had actually occurred in such a short time, and how dangerous it could have gotten if I hadn't started documenting everything. That night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a notification on my phone from the security camera app. I opened it and saw footage of someone standing at my apartment door trying the handle, their face partially visible in the dim hallway light. I watched in real time as they tested the door several times before walking away down the hall. My hands were shaking as I immediately called 911 to report an attempted break-in. The dispatcher said she would send an officer, but it might take 30 to 40 minutes because they were dealing with another call. I sat in my locked apartment with all the lights on, watching the live camera feed on my phone and feeling my heart pound in my chest. Every little sound in the building made me jump. A police car finally pulled up almost an hour later, and an officer came to my door. He took a brief statement and I showed him the camera footage on my phone, but he didn't seem very concerned about what I was showing him. He said it looked like someone testing doors to see if they were unlocked, which apparently happens sometimes, and told me I should just make sure I keep everything locked. When I tried to explain about the pattern of harassment and the memorial photo, and everything else that had been happening, he cut me off and said that was a separate issue I needed to take up with the county, not something for a police response. He left after maybe 10 minutes, and I felt even more alone than before I'd called. The next morning, I checked my email and found a message from someone named Samara Jennings, who said she was a freelance journalist working on a story about small-town record suppression. She wrote that she'd received a tip about my situation in Millbrook, and wanted to have an off-the-record conversation if I was willing to talk. I stared at the email feeling suspicious about how she'd found me and who would have given her a tip, but I was also desperate for someone with actual resources who might be able to help me figure out what was really going on in this town. I replied to Samara's email saying I'd meet her but wanted it somewhere public and away from Millbrook. She wrote back within an hour with the name of a coffee shop in the county seat and a time the next afternoon. I spent that evening organizing all my documentation into a folder on my phone, making sure every photo had a date stamp and every incident had notes about what happened. The security camera footage, the threatening note, the memorial photo, the screenshots of dead links, everything went into one place, so I could show her the full picture. I barely slept that night thinking about whether this was the right move, whether bringing in a journalist would help me or just make the town angrier. The next day, I drove 40 minutes to the county seat, checking my mirrors the whole way to make sure nobody from Millbrook was following me. The coffee shop was busy with the lunch crowd when I arrived, and I spotted Samara at a corner table with a notebook and a small recording device sitting next to her coffee cup. She was in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back and sharp eyes that looked like they didn't miss much. I sat down across from her and she introduced herself properly, explaining that she'd been working on a story about how small towns sometimes hide information that could lead to legal problems for them. When I pulled out my phone and started showing her my evidence folder, walking through each incident and each piece of documentation, I watched her face shift from polite interest to genuine focus. She took notes while I talked, asking specific questions about dates and who was involved in each incident. When I showed her the memorial photo and explained about the scratched-off headstone, she leaned forward and asked if I'd tried searching for sealed court records. I told her about hitting dead ends everywhere I looked, about the librarian's whisper of February 2019, about how every online reference had been scrubbed. Samara nodded like this confirmed something she already suspected. She told me this fit a pattern she'd seen before in other small towns where something bad happened, and local officials worked together to bury it. Towns that faced wrongful death lawsuits or civil rights claims sometimes closed ranks to protect themselves from financial liability and bad publicity. She said she'd be willing to do some digging into Millbrook's public records and any legal settlements from 2019, but she'd keep my name out of it for now to protect me from more harassment. I felt this weird mix of hope and fear sitting there. Hope that someone with actual resources might help me find answers, but fear that if the town found out I'd talked to a journalist, things could get much worse. Samara must have seen something in my face because she told me to be careful and to document everything that happened from here on out. We exchanged phone numbers and she said she'd be in touch once she had something concrete. I drove back to my apartment feeling like I'd just taken a step I couldn't take back, like I'd crossed some invisible line by bringing in outside help. 2 days went by with me jumping every time my phone rang, checking the security camera constantly, barely leaving my apartment except for quick trips to buy food. Then Isabel called me on my cell and asked if I could come to her office during her lunch break. I drove to the county clerk's office and found her alone in a small back room with the door closed. She looked nervous but determined as she told me she'd done some searching on her own time, looking through state-level records that weren't part of her normal access. She'd found a sealed wrongful death settlement filed in March 2019 that involved Millbrook. She couldn't give me details because of the seal, couldn't tell me names or amounts or specifics, but she confirmed it existed and that it was big enough to require state court approval instead of just local handling. Her voice was quiet when she said this, like she was worried someone might overhear even though we were alone. I felt my stomach drop because this confirmed what everyone had been hinting at, that someone actually died here, and the town had paid money to make the legal problems go away. I thanked Isabel for taking the risk to help me, and she said she believed in people having access to information even when it was complicated. Before I left, she suggested something I hadn't thought of, that I might be able to petition for access to my own birth records if I thought there was a connection to Millbrook, because those were handled differently than court records. She said birth certificates and adoption records had different rules, and might not be sealed the same way. I drove back home thinking about what she'd said, about birth records, and why the town might be so scared of me specifically. That night around 11, my phone rang from a blocked number. I almost didn't answer because I'd been getting random calls all week, but something made me pick up. A man's voice said, "I tried to stop them in 2019, and then went quiet." My heart started racing, and I asked who he was, what he meant, who he tried to stop. The silence stretched out so long I thought he'd hung up, but then he said his name was Dorian Crowley, and that we needed to meet somewhere public where people wouldn't recognize me. He gave me the name of a diner 30 miles away, and said he'd be there tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon if I wanted to know what really happened. Then he hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat there staring at my phone, my hands shaking, trying to figure out if this was a trap, or if this was the person Elena had told me about, the former cop who left town suddenly. I called Elena and told her about the call, and she said it had to be the same Crowley she'd heard about, the one who quit the police force in 2019. She warned me to be careful, but said if he really did try to stop something bad from happening, he might be the only person willing to tell me the truth. I spent the next day feeling sick with worry about whether meeting this guy was smart or dangerous. I texted Elena the name of the diner and made her promise that if I didn't check in every hour, she'd call the police. I called Karim too, and he told me to record the whole conversation on my phone if I could, and to make sure I met during daylight with other people around. He said not to go anywhere private with this person no matter what they suggested. I drove to the diner with my phone already recording in my jacket pocket. my hands squeezing the steering wheel so tight they hurt. The whole drive I kept thinking about what this Crowley person might tell me, what he tried to stop, why he was willing to talk now after 5 years of silence. The diner was one of those old-style places with a long counter and vinyl booths, half full with people eating late lunch. I spotted him right away sitting in a back booth, a man in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd seen things he wished he could forget. He nodded when I walked over and I slid into the seat across from him, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. Crowley ordered coffee for both of us and then started talking in a low voice, telling me that in February 2019, a woman who looked exactly like me came to Millbrook asking questions about her birth family. He said she'd been going around town for about 2 weeks, talking to older residents, looking through records at the courthouse, asking about adoptions from the 1990s. The town had secrets they didn't want dug up, things about how adoptions were handled back then, about families who didn't want it known they'd given up babies. When this woman wouldn't stop asking questions and wouldn't leave town, a group of people decided to take matters into their own hands. Crowley's voice got quieter as he described how they confronted her in the street one evening, how things got physical when she tried to walk away. He said several townspeople grabbed her and held her down, claiming they were doing a citizen's arrest for trespassing and disturbing the peace. They held her face down on the pavement and someone pressed on her back to keep her still. She kept saying she couldn't breathe, but they didn't let up. By the time Crowley got there as a responding officer, she was unconscious. He tried to get them off her, tried to start CPR, but it was already too late. She died 2 days later in the hospital, and the official report called it an accident, said she had a pre-existing condition that caused her to stop breathing. But Crowley knew it was because they'd held her down too long, pressed too hard, ignored her when she said she couldn't breathe. He looked me straight in the eyes when he said it was a vigilante action that went way too far. He told me the town leaders moved fast after she died, calling emergency meetings, bringing in lawyers, sealing everything they could seal. They paid the woman's family a big settlement in exchange for signing agreements that they wouldn't talk about what happened and wouldn't press criminal charges. They scrubbed news coverage, called in favors with the regional papers to take down articles, pressured people who worked at libraries and government offices to remove references to the incident from public databases. Crowley said he quit the police force 3 months later because he couldn't live with being part of the cover-up, couldn't keep pretending it was just an unfortunate accident when he knew the truth. But he'd been too scared to speak up publicly, because the town had made it clear that anyone who talked would face serious problems. He said he was finally reaching out now because when he heard about someone who looked just like the dead woman moving to Millbrook, he knew the town would panic and he was worried they might do something similar again. I asked him who the woman was, if he knew her real name or anything about where she came from. He said she'd been using a different name than what was on her birth certificate, probably her adoptive name from whatever family raised her. He believed she was adopted as a baby and came to Millbrook searching for her biological family, trying to find out where she came from. But the town saw her as a threat to their reputation and their secrets, saw her questions as attacks on families who wanted their past kept private. When I pulled out my phone and showed him the memorial photo from the cemetery, he nodded slowly and said, "That was definitely her. That was the woman who died." He said the resemblance between us was so strong it was no wonder everyone in town was scared out of their minds. When I showed up, thinking maybe I was here for the same reason she was, thinking maybe I'd cause the same kind of trouble that would bring investigators and lawyers and bad publicity back to Millbrook. Crowley leaned forward and told me I should look into sealed adoption records because he thought the dead woman might have had siblings, and that could explain why we look identical. He said the town would do everything possible to prevent me from uncovering the truth, because they were afraid of legal liability and outside scrutiny. He offered to provide a written statement about what he witnessed if I decided to pursue legal action, but he made me promise to keep his involvement quiet until I had protection in place. I nodded and told him I understood, and we exchanged phone numbers before he left through the back exit of the diner. I sat there for another 10 minutes staring at my cold coffee, trying to process everything he'd told me about my sister dying because people held her down too long. The drive back to Millbrook felt surreal, like I was moving through water. My mind kept replaying Crowley's words about the vigilante restraint, about her saying she couldn't breathe, about the cover-up that followed. The grief hit me suddenly about 20 minutes from town, this overwhelming sadness for someone I never knew, and I had to pull over on the side of the road. I put my head on the steering wheel and cried until my chest hurt, mourning a sister I didn't know existed until a few weeks ago. When I finally made it back to my apartment, it was almost dark, and Elena must have been watching because she came over within minutes of me parking. She took one look at my face and asked what happened, and I told her everything Crowley said while she listened with her hand over her mouth. She kept saying, "Oh my God, and that's horrible," as I described the restraint and the settlement and the systematic cover-up. When I finished, she hugged me hard and said she was so sorry that she couldn't imagine what I was going through. The next morning, I called Samara and shared Crowley's information with her, including his contact details and his offer to provide a statement. She was quiet for a long time taking notes, and then she told me she'd start digging into what could be verified independently. 2 hours later, she called back and said she'd found a cached version of a brief news article from a regional paper in February 2019 about a woman dying after a public disturbance in Millbrook. The article was taken down within days, but someone had mirrored it on an overseas archive site, and it confirmed the basic timeline Crowley described. Samara explained this was enough to start building a real story, but she needed more documentation, and ideally another source before her editor would approve publication. I checked my mailbox that afternoon and found an anonymous envelope with no return address, just my name typed on the front. Inside was a photocopy of what appeared to be part of a birth certificate with my birth hospital listed, the same hospital located just outside Millbrook. The document was incomplete with sections blacked out, but it showed a notation of baby B next to the date. My hands started shaking as I realized this might be evidence that I was part of a multiple birth, that there was a baby A who stayed in Millbrook while I was adopted out. I immediately took photos of the document and called Kareem to tell him what I'd received. He warned me that the birth certificate fragment could be bait designed to make me act rashly, or to discredit my claims by mixing real documents with fake ones. He told me not to confront anyone publicly with this information until we could verify it through official channels. I felt frustrated by the need for caution when I wanted immediate answers, but I understood that moving too fast could mess up everything I was trying to accomplish. That afternoon, I needed to mail something at the post office, and Elena offered to walk with me since she had errands too. We were about halfway there when she grabbed my arm and nodded toward a figure behind us, and I turned to see Carl from the hardware store staying about half a block back. Elena pulled out her phone and started taking photos of him, clearly tracking my movements, getting shots that showed him stopping when we stopped and continuing when we continued. When we got to the post office, she wrote down everything she'd observed with times and descriptions, providing a written statement about what she saw. I drove to the county sheriff's office and filed an updated harassment report, and this time the deputy actually seemed to take it more seriously, now that I had a witness who was a local resident with no apparent reason to lie. Over the next few days, the harassment got worse instead of better. I woke up one morning to find a flyer on my apartment door calling me an arsonist and liar in large printed letters. My security camera had captured 2 people posting it at 3 in the morning, though their faces were partially hidden by hoods. I took photos of the flyer before removing it and added everything to my evidence file, noting that the accusations made no sense unless they were confusing me with the dead woman. I sent all the new documentation to Kareem, and he said we had enough for a protective order motion. He filed paperwork with the county court attaching my complete harassment log, the security camera footage, Elena's witness statement, and photos of the threatening flyer. He requested a temporary protective order against specific individuals, including Carl and the 2 people visible on camera. The hearing was scheduled for 5 days away, which felt like forever when I was still trapped in a hostile town with no way to leave safely. The night after Elena provided her witness statement, she called me crying and angry. Her car had been keyed in her parking spot with deep scratches spelling out traitor across the driver's side door. I felt terrible guilt that she was facing punishment for helping me, and I told her she could take back her statement if she needed to. She refused firmly and said that what the town did in 2019 was wrong, and what they were doing to me now was wrong, and she wasn't going to be silent anymore. 2 days before the hearing, Crowley contacted me again through an encrypted message app. He said he had additional details about the 2019 woman, including that she'd reported being followed and harassed for several weeks before the fatal confrontation. He had copies of her police reports that were never properly investigated, and he was willing to turn them over if I could guarantee they'd be used to push for a real investigation. The reports showed a clear pattern of getting worse over time that looked exactly like what I was experiencing now. Samara connected me with an adoption attorney who specialized in unsealing records, and I met her at her office 2 days later. The attorney explained that birth certificates could be unsealed when there was compelling need, like threats to safety or medical history concerns, and we spent an hour drafting a petition that laid out everything I was facing in Millbrook. She reviewed my harassment log and the police reports, and said a judge would likely grant access given the unusual circumstances and the documented pattern of intimidation. We filed the petition that afternoon with the county court, attaching copies of all my evidence and a statement explaining why I needed to understand my biological connections to the town. The attorney seemed confident, but warned me that even expedited requests usually took several weeks to process through the system. I drove back to my apartment feeling like I'd taken a real step forward instead of just reacting to what the town was doing to me. 3 days later, Isabel called and said she'd flagged my petition for priority review using her position at the clerk's office, making sure it wouldn't sit in the usual backlog for months. She couldn't guarantee approval, but she could make sure a judge actually looked at it quickly. 2 weeks after filing, I got a notice in the mail saying my request had been granted, and I could pick up my original birth certificate from the state vital records office during business hours. My hands shook as I read the letter over and over, knowing that this single document might finally confirm whether I'd had a twin sister. I called Kareem to let him know, and he said this was a major breakthrough that could change everything about my legal options. The next morning, I made the 2-hour drive to the state capitol with my stomach tight and my mind racing through every possible outcome. The Vital Records office was in a gray government building downtown, and I had to show 2 forms of ID and sign multiple forms before a clerk disappeared into a back room to retrieve my file. When she returned with a sealed envelope, I almost couldn't make myself open it right there at the counter. I walked back to my car in the parking garage and sat in the driver's seat with the envelope in my lap for 5 full minutes before I finally tore it open. The original birth certificate listed my birth mother's name as someone from Millbrook, a name I didn't recognize at all, and there in the notes section it clearly showed Twin B, with Twin A's information redacted due to separate adoption. I stared at those words until they blurred, the confirmation hitting me like a physical weight in my chest. I had an identical twin sister who was also given up for adoption, who grew up somewhere else not knowing I existed, who came to Millbrook searching for answers and died for it. I put my head down on the steering wheel and cried for the sister I never knew, for the life we might have had if we'd found each other some other way, for the fact that she died alone and afraid in a town that saw her as a threat. After a while, I took photos of every page of the birth certificate and uploaded them to my secure cloud storage, then called Samara to tell her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment, and then said she'd been working on getting a photo of the 2019 woman, and thought she'd finally tracked one down. 2 hours later, she sent me an image file she'd pulled from an archived social media profile that had been deleted shortly after the woman's death. I opened it on my phone and felt like I was looking in a mirror, the same face down to the small scar above the left eyebrow that I got falling off a bike when I was 8. Samara confirmed the woman had been using a different name than what appeared on the birth certificate, probably her adoptive name, and that her posts from the months before her death showed she was actively searching for her biological family. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I saved the photo and sat in my car looking between it and my own reflection in the rearview mirror, seeing my sister's face for the first time and realizing she'd been just as lost as I was. That night, I called my mom from my apartment and asked her directly if she knew I had a twin. There was a long silence on the line, and then she admitted that yes, they knew about a twin when they adopted me, but they were told the other baby was adopted by a different family, and they never knew what happened to her. She claimed they had no idea my sister ended up in Millbrook, or that anything bad had happened to her, and that my aunt was the one who maintained some contact with people from our birth mother's family. The words felt like a betrayal that went deeper than anything the town had done. The realization that my own family had lied to me about something this fundamental for my entire life. I asked why they never told me, and she said they thought it was better not to complicate things, that knowing about a twin I'd never meet would just cause pain. I hung up feeling like I didn't know who I was anymore, like every foundation I'd built my identity on was false. 2 days later, my aunt called from a new number and I answered even though part of me wanted to ignore it. She admitted right away that she knew my twin sister existed, and that she'd heard about the troubled girl who died in Millbrook in 2019, but didn't realize it was my sister until recently. She begged me to leave town quietly and stop digging into the past, saying some things were better left buried and that the family had accepted money to keep everything sealed. Her words made me realize my adoptive family was part of the cover-up, that they'd taken settlement money in exchange for silence about my sister's death, and never told me any of it. I asked how much they got paid for my sister's life, and she hung up on me without answering. I sat on my apartment floor feeling completely alone, surrounded by people who'd lied to me and a town that wanted me dead. When I called Kareem the next day, he listened to everything about the twin confirmation and my family's involvement, and then he said we now had grounds to request a state-level investigation into both my sister's death and the coordinated intimidation I was facing. He spent the next week drafting a formal complaint to the state attorney general's office that laid out the entire pattern of civil rights violations and potential criminal misconduct by Millbrook officials. The complaint included copies of the birth certificate, Crowley's account, the harassment documentation, and evidence of the town's systematic cover-up. Filing it felt like crossing a line I couldn't come back from, but I was done being afraid of what these people might do. 3 days after we submitted the complaint, Crowley contacted me through the encrypted app and said he had one more piece of evidence I needed to see. He sent me a scanned copy of an internal memo from February 2019 that explicitly instructed town employees to remove all references to the incident from public databases and records. The memo was signed by the town manager and copied to the police chief, the clerk's office, and the public library, proving the cover-up was coordinated from the top levels of town government. I forwarded it to Kareem immediately, and he said this document alone could be enough to trigger criminal charges for obstruction of justice. The protective order hearing arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I drove to the county courthouse with Elena, both of us nervous but determined to tell the truth. I testified first, walking the judge through the harassment log with specific dates and times, showing him photos of the threatening flyer and security camera footage of people trying my door at night. I explained about the slashed tires and the constant surveillance, and the way townspeople had made it impossible for me to leave safely. Elena testified next about witnessing Carl following me, and about the retaliation she faced when she provided a witness statement, showing photos of her keyed car with the word traitor scratched into the paint. The judge reviewed all the evidence carefully, watching the security footage multiple times, and reading through the harassment log page by page. He asked questions about specific incidents and seemed genuinely concerned about the pattern of coordinated behavior. After hearing everything, he granted a 6-month protective order requiring Carl and several other named individuals to stay at least 100 yards away from me and prohibiting any contact, direct or indirect. The order was served that same afternoon to everyone listed, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe the legal system was actually going to protect me. The next morning, I woke up to find a burned matchbook sitting on my doorstep in clear violation of the protective order that had been served less than 24 hours earlier. My security camera had captured a partial license plate of the car that dropped it off and drove away quickly. I called the county sheriff immediately and reported the violation, and this time the response was actually fast, because violating a court order carried real consequences that general harassment didn't. A deputy called me back within 2 hours saying they'd traced the partial plate to a vehicle registered to a town employee who worked in the clerk's office, and they were preparing to make contact about the violation. Kareem called me the next morning and said he was forwarding everything to state police, because the local sheriff's department had too many connections to Millbrook to handle this fairly. He explained that when a protective order gets violated within 24 hours of being served, it shows the person doesn't take the legal system seriously and needs a stronger response. I could hear him typing while we talked, attaching files to his email. He sent copies of the security footage, the partial plate match, and his own statement explaining why local enforcement couldn't be trusted to protect me. Within 3 hours, a state trooper called me directly to confirm the details and said they'd be making contact with the town employee that afternoon. The trooper's voice was calm and professional, completely different from the dismissive local cops I'd dealt with before. He told me to call his direct number if anything else happened, and said they were taking the violation seriously, because it showed a pattern of coordinated harassment that went beyond normal neighbor disputes. That same day, I started seeing angry posts on Millbrook's community Facebook page about state police interfering in local matters and outsiders causing trouble for hardworking town employees. Someone posted a vague threat about people who don't know when to leave well enough alone, and 3 others shared it with comments about protecting their community from lies and manipulation. The online reaction made my stomach hurt because it proved the whole town was watching everything I did and coordinating their responses. I decided I needed to visit my sister's grave one more time, but do it right this time, with witnesses and documentation that couldn't be dismissed or hidden. I called Elena and asked if she'd come with me in broad daylight with her phone ready to film everything. She agreed immediately and said she'd been thinking we should do exactly that, creating a public record of who my sister was and why I was here. We stopped at a flower shop and I bought a small bouquet of white roses, the kind you bring to someone you're mourning even though you never got to know them. The cemetery was empty when we arrived just after noon, the sun bright and warm on the grass. I walked to the grave with the scratched-off name and the visible death date of February 15, 2019, and I knelt down in front of it while Elena stood a few feet back with her phone camera recording. I placed the flowers against the headstone and took a deep breath before I started speaking. I said my name out loud and explained that I was the twin sister of the woman buried here, that we'd been separated at birth through adoption, and I never knew she existed until I came to this town. I talked about how she came here looking for answers about her biological family, and how the people of Millbrook killed her for asking questions they didn't want to answer. My voice shook when I said that I was going to make sure everyone knew the truth about what happened, that her death wouldn't stay hidden and scrubbed from public record anymore. I promised her that I'd fight to get justice even though it came 5 years too late to save her life. Elena kept filming the whole time, capturing my words and the grave and the quiet cemetery around us. When I finished talking, I stayed kneeling there for another minute, my hand on the cold stone, feeling the weight of having a sister I'd never meet, and a family history that had been deliberately kept from me. Back at my apartment, Elena suggested she should record her own statement while we had good lighting and clear audio, creating evidence that showed I wasn't the only person who witnessed the harassment and retaliation. She sat in my living room chair and spoke directly to the camera, using her full first name but not her last name for safety reasons. She described the patterns she'd seen since I moved to town, the way people watched my building, and followed me on the street, the threatening flyer that appeared on my door, and her own car getting keyed with the word traitor after she provided a witness statement supporting my protective order request. Her voice was steady and clear as she explained that she was speaking up because what happened in 2019 was wrong, and what was happening to me now was wrong, and she refused to stay silent while her neighbors tried to intimidate someone for seeking the truth about her sister's death. She talked about the fear she felt living in a town where everyone seemed to know about a cover-up, and went along with it, and how that fear was nothing compared to what I must be experiencing as the target of their collective anger. When she finished recording, we uploaded both videos to 3 different cloud storage accounts with passwords we both knew, making sure the evidence couldn't be lost if something happened to our phones or computers. The act of documenting everything felt like building a wall of protection made out of truth and testimony, something that couldn't be torn down or hidden the way my sister's death had been. Samara called me 2 days later and said her investigation was complete and her article was ready for publication. She'd spent weeks verifying every detail, tracking down the internal memo Crowley provided, confirming the sealed court records, and documenting the harassment I'd experienced with photos and witness statements. Her editor had reviewed everything with their legal team and approved it for publication on their regional news site. which had enough readership to get attention but wasn't. So big that Millbrook could easily pressure them to kill the story. The article was scheduled to run in 3 days, giving me time to prepare for whatever reaction would come. Samara read me the headline over the phone, and it made my heart race with fear and satisfaction at the same time. She'd included Crowley's account of what he witnessed in 2019, excerpts from the internal memo showing the deliberate cover-up, my documentation of harassment with specific dates and incidents, and Elena's witness statement about the retaliation she faced. The article laid out a clear timeline showing how town officials had systematically suppressed information about a vigilante killing, and then targeted me when I arrived asking questions. Samara promised to protect my safety by not including my current address, or any details that would make it easy for people to find me. But she was honest that publication would make things harder before they got better. I told her to run it anyway because I was done hiding, and done letting Millbrook control the narrative about what happened to my sister. The article went live on a Thursday morning with the headline, "Small Town's Deadly Secret, How Millbrook Covered Up a Vigilante Killing," in large, bold text across the top. I sat at my laptop refreshing the page and watching the view counter climb from dozens to hundreds to thousands within the first hour. The comments section filled up fast with people expressing shock and anger, some defending Millbrook as a good town being unfairly attacked, and others demanding accountability for what clearly looked like a criminal conspiracy. By afternoon, the article was shared across multiple social media platforms and picked up by other regional news outlets who added their own coverage. A local TV station sent a reporter to Millbrook and filmed outside the town hall, interviewing residents who either refused to comment or insisted the whole story was lies from troublemakers. The state attorney general's office released a brief statement saying they were opening a preliminary review into the allegations and would determine if further investigation was warranted. Millbrook's town manager issued his own statement calling the article a one-sided attack based on unreliable sources, and promising that the town had acted appropriately in all matters. Reading his denial made me angry because I had the documents and witnesses that proved otherwise, but I also knew that official denial was often the first step before people in power were forced to admit the truth. The immediate fallout hit me like a wave I wasn't prepared for, even though I knew it was coming. My phone started buzzing constantly with messages from people I'd never met, some offering support and sympathy, while others sent threats about what happens to people who spread lies about good communities. I had to turn off all notifications because the constant stream of responses was making me panic, and I couldn't tell which messages were safe to open. Kareem called and told me firmly to stay inside my apartment and avoid any public places or confrontations while tensions were this high, because angry people do stupid things when they feel attacked, and I was the visible target of that anger. He said the protective order would help, but it couldn't protect me from random violence if someone decided I'd gone too far. Elena came over that evening with an overnight bag and said she wasn't leaving me alone while the town was this worked up, and I was grateful for her presence even though I felt guilty that she kept putting herself at risk for me. We sat together watching news coverage on my laptop, seeing Millbrook residents interviewed about the controversy, and town officials scrambling to control the damage. Some people who were quoted anonymously admitted they'd heard rumors about what really happened in 2019, but had been too afraid to speak up, and their admissions felt like small cracks appearing in the wall of silence that had protected the cover-up for 5 years. 2 days after publication, Crowley contacted me through the encrypted app and said state investigators had reached out requesting a formal interview. He was meeting with them that afternoon to provide a sworn affidavit about everything he witnessed in 2019 and the subsequent cover-up he'd participated in before resigning. He sounded nervous, but determined when he told me that testifying was the right thing to do, even though it meant burning bridges with people he'd known for years, and potentially facing legal consequences for his own role in suppressing evidence. I thanked him for his courage and told him that without his willingness to come forward, none of this would have been possible, because official documents and witness statements from someone inside the system carried weight that my personal testimony couldn't match on its own. Later that evening, he sent me a brief message saying the interview had gone well, and the investigators seemed to take his account seriously, treating him as a credible witness rather than a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. The fact that state authorities were actively investigating rather than just reviewing paperwork felt like real progress toward accountability. Isabel called me from a number I didn't recognize and explained that she was facing internal pushback for her role in helping me access records. Some Millbrook officials had filed complaints accusing her of violating confidentiality rules and inappropriately assisting someone who was attacking their town's reputation. Her supervisor had conducted a formal review of her actions and concluded that she'd acted within policy guidelines, since the records she helped me access were technically public, even if they required special procedures to obtain. But despite being cleared of wrongdoing, she was being quietly reassigned to different duties that didn't involve Millbrook records or any cases that might create similar conflicts. Her voice was tired but not regretful when she told me this, and she said she'd do it all again because government transparency matters more than political convenience or protecting officials who abuse their power. I apologized for the professional consequences she was facing because of me, but she cut me off and said I hadn't done anything wrong and she'd made her own choice to help, because it was the ethical thing to do. The conversation reminded me that speaking truth in systems that prefer silence always costs something, and the people who pay that cost deserve recognition for their courage. Over the next several weeks, the state investigation proceeded with methodical thoroughness that felt both reassuring and frustratingly slow. Investigators interviewed dozens of Millbrook residents, reviewed sealed court documents with judicial permission, and examined the internal communications that showed coordination of the cover-up. The Attorney General's office released periodic updates indicating they were considering charges related to civil rights violations and obstruction of justice, though they were careful not to name specific individuals until the investigation was complete. Millbrook's town council held an emergency meeting that was covered by local news, and they voted to cooperate fully with the investigation and implement new transparency policies for public records. The sudden shift from denial to cooperation was obvious damage control, an attempt to minimize legal liability by appearing reasonable now that their actions were under scrutiny. I watched the meeting coverage with mixed feelings because cooperation felt like a small victory, but it also felt hollow when it only came after they'd been exposed and had no other choice. Real accountability would mean criminal charges for the people who killed my sister and the officials who covered it up, not just policy changes and promises to do better in the future. Kareem started working with state police to develop a safe exit plan for me because staying in Millbrook was becoming more dangerous as the investigation continued and tensions remained high. We coordinated a specific date and time when I could pack my essential belongings and leave town with a state trooper escort, ensuring no one would try to stop me or follow me to my next location. He also filed paperwork to extend the protective order and register it in multiple jurisdictions, so it would remain legally enforceable wherever I relocated, creating a paper trail that would make violations easier to prosecute. The planning process felt surreal because I was essentially preparing to escape from an American town in 2024 like I was fleeing some kind of danger zone, which I guess I was. Kareem kept emphasizing that my safety was the priority, and that I could continue pursuing legal action from a distance once I was somewhere secure. He'd already started drafting a civil lawsuit on behalf of my sister's memory, using all the evidence we'd gathered to build a case for wrongful death and systematic civil rights violations. The idea that I might actually get justice for what happened to her felt almost impossible to believe after weeks of feeling powerless and afraid, but the legal machinery was finally moving in the right direction, and I was determined to see it through no matter how long it took. The day before my scheduled departure, I started packing everything I owned into boxes and suitcases, sorting through 6 weeks of life in an apartment that felt more like a cell than a home. Elena came over around noon with packing tape and markers, and we worked methodically through each room without talking much because there wasn't much left to say. I kept only what I could fit in my car, leaving behind furniture and kitchen items that the landlord said I could abandon since I was breaking the lease early. Before sealing the last boxes, I sat at my small kitchen table and wrote out a statement on plain paper, documenting every incident of harassment with dates and times, explaining that I was leaving Millbrook because I feared for my safety and intended to pursue legal action against those responsible for my sister's death and the cover-up that followed. Elena drove me to a notary public in the next town over where a woman with reading glasses stamped and signed my statement, making it an official legal document that proved I wasn't running away, but strategically retreating. Back at the apartment, Elena promised to check my mailbox weekly and forward anything important to the P.O. box I'd set up in my new city, and she gave me a tight hug that lasted longer than either of us expected. That night, I barely slept, lying awake in the empty apartment with my packed car parked right outside, where I could see it from the window, half expecting someone to slash the tires again or leave another threatening message. The next morning, I woke up early and made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of leaving quietly like Kareem had suggested, I carried a folding chair outside and set it up on the sidewalk in front of my building in full daylight. Elena arrived with her phone ready to film, positioning herself across the street to get a clear angle of everything that was about to happen. Within 10 minutes, a small crowd had gathered, maybe 15 or 20 people who lived nearby or were passing through, all of them staring at me with expressions ranging from confusion to anger to something that might have been shame. I stood up and looked directly at them, my hands shaking but my voice steady when I started talking. I told them my full name and said I was the identical twin sister of the woman who died in Millbrook on February 15th, 2019, the woman they had restrained in the street until she stopped breathing. I said I was leaving because I was afraid they would do to me what they did to her, but that the truth was now part of the public record, and no amount of sealed documents or intimidation would bury it again. Some people in the crowd looked away or walked off quickly, but others stayed and listened, and I saw a few faces that looked genuinely upset about what had happened. I finished by saying that I hoped they would think about what kind of town they wanted to live in, and whether silence was really worth the cost of a woman's life. Then I sat back down and waited, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The state trooper arrived exactly on schedule at 9:30, pulling up in a marked patrol car with lights but no siren. He was a professional officer in his 40s who introduced himself and asked if I was ready to go, and I said yes while Elena kept filming everything. I got in my car and the trooper pulled out first, then waited for me to follow, creating a small convoy that drove slowly through Millbrook's main street. Elena filmed from the sidewalk as we passed, capturing the moment I finally escaped the town that had killed my sister and tried to silence me. As we crossed the town limits, I felt this weird mix of relief and grief hit me all at once, knowing I was safe, but also knowing my sister never got this chance to leave. The trooper followed me for another 20 miles before flashing his lights and pulling over to make sure I knew the route to my destination, and then he turned around and headed back while I kept driving. 2 hours later, I pulled up to a small furnished apartment in a city I'd never visited before, a one-bedroom place on the 3rd floor of a building that felt anonymous and safe. The landlord handed over the keys without asking questions beyond the standard lease paperwork, and I moved my boxes inside in 3 trips, stacking them against the walls of the empty living room. That first night in the new place, I couldn't sleep again, but for different reasons. My body still wired for danger, even though I was finally somewhere the people from Millbrook couldn't reach me. The next week, I found a therapist who specialized in trauma and complicated grief, a woman in her 50s who listened carefully. When I explained that I'd just discovered I had a twin sister who'd been killed, and that I'd spent 6 weeks being terrorized by the people responsible, the therapy sessions were harder than I expected, because I had to process not just what happened in Millbrook, but also the fact that my whole family had lied to me about having a sister. She gave me tools to manage the anxiety that would hit without warning, sudden panic attacks when I heard footsteps in the hallway or saw someone who looked like they might be from Millbrook. Samara's follow-up article came out 3 weeks after I left town, detailing how the state investigation was moving forward and documenting similar patterns of record suppression in other small towns across the region. Her reporting put real pressure on Millbrook officials because now other communities were watching to see how the case would be handled, and the town council held another meeting where they announced new policies requiring independent review of any attempts to seal public records. The changes felt small and inadequate compared to what had happened to my sister, but they were more than existed before I showed up. 3 months after I left Millbrook, Kareem called with an update that made my hands shake. The state investigation had wrapped up with official findings that town officials had violated civil rights laws and obstructed justice in their handling of my sister's death. Several officials were facing administrative sanctions that would affect their jobs and pensions, and one former police chief was actually being charged with evidence tampering for his role in destroying records. The Attorney General's office also announced that families affected by similar cover-ups might have grounds to file civil claims, which opened the door for my sister's adoptive family to pursue justice if they wanted to. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a law firm I didn't recognize, and the attorney on the line explained that my sister's adoptive family had decided to file a wrongful death lawsuit now that the NDA was void because of the criminal investigation. They wanted to know if I wanted to be involved as a co-plaintiff representing my sister's memory, and I told them I needed to think about it and talk to Kareem first. Kareem explained that joining the lawsuit meant I'd be part of the legal proceedings, and might have to give statements or attend hearings, but it also meant I'd have a voice in how my sister was remembered, and what kind of accountability the town would face. I decided to join because even though I never knew my sister, I felt like I owed it to her to make sure her death meant something. The lawsuit we filed sought damages not just for her death, but for the whole systematic cover-up that had prevented any accountability for 5 years. Elena drove up to visit me one weekend about 4 months after I'd left, and we spent 2 days together just talking and walking around the city like normal people who weren't carrying trauma. She told me she was thinking about leaving Millbrook herself, because the town felt different now, split between people who still defended what happened and people who were ashamed they'd been part of it. I told her to do whatever felt right for her safety and happiness, that she'd already given up enough by standing with me when it was dangerous. We didn't talk much about Millbrook after that, just enjoyed being together without fear. 6 months after leaving Millbrook, I organized a small memorial service for my twin sister, using her real name from the birth certificate, the name she was born with before adoption. I invited Crowley, Elena, Samara, and Kareem, the 4 people who had helped me uncover the truth and survive what came after. We met at a quiet spot by a lake about an hour from my new city, and I read a statement I'd written about my sister's life and death. I said that even though I never knew her, I was committed to making sure she was remembered truthfully, and that her death led to real changes. Everyone there had risked something to help me, and standing together by that lake felt like we were honoring not just my sister, but also the choice to speak truth even when it cost something. The wrongful death lawsuit took another 3 months to work through the legal system, but eventually Millbrook's lawyers approached us about settling out of court. The settlement was big enough to matter. Several $100,000 split between my sister's adoptive family and me, and it came with requirements that the town had to follow. Millbrook agreed to create a public memorial acknowledging what happened in February 2019, with my sister's name and a statement about the need for transparency and accountability. The settlement also required annual civil rights training for all town employees and set up an independent oversight committee to review any future attempts to seal public records. It wasn't perfect justice because the people who actually killed my sister never faced criminal charges, but it was real accountability that my sister never got when she was alive. 3 months after the settlement, I enrolled in an online paralegal certification program that let me study while working part-time at a legal aid office. The coursework was harder than I expected, but I pushed through the contracts modules and civil procedure classes because I wanted to understand the systems that had failed my sister. I spent my evenings reading case law about civil rights violations and wrongful death claims, taking notes on precedents that might help other people trapped in situations like mine. Kareem told me that once I finished my certification, he'd bring me on as an intern at his firm, working specifically on cases involving government transparency and accountability. I accepted immediately because the work felt right, like I was taking everything I'd learned and turning it into something useful. My sister's death had given me a clear direction that I didn't have before, a sense that I could help prevent other families from facing the same cover-ups and lies that had kept the truth buried for 5 years. A year after discovering I had a twin, I drove back to the quiet spot by the lake where we'd held the small memorial service. I brought fresh flowers and a photo I'd made showing both of us as kids, 2 identical faces from different families in different places. I set them at the base of the marker I'd placed there with my sister's real name engraved on it. Standing there, I felt the weight of mourning someone I never knew, mixed with relief that I'd survived and found my voice when she couldn't. I was building a real life now under my own name, with Elena checking in regularly and Kareem mentoring me through my legal studies. I'd started speaking at community forums about the importance of transparent public records and the dangers of small towns protecting their own at any cost. The grief was still there and probably always would be, but I'd learned to carry it alongside the work I was doing to make sure other people didn't face the same injustice my sister did. So yeah, that's it. Nothing over the top, just one of those stories that stuck around. Thanks for hanging out again. It always feels like catching up with a friend. Come back when you're in the mood for another one.